Adolf Hitler was the dictator of Nazi Germany from 1933 until his suicide in 1945. The man who ordered and oversaw the Holocaust that murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others, who started World War II that killed over 70 million people, and who brought catastrophic destruction to Europe and the world. Hitler's decisions and actions shaped the course of the 20th century in the most terrible ways. Yet the actual day-to-day reality of how Hitler lived and worked, what he did during the hours between waking and sleeping, how he organized his time, and what his daily routine looked like, is less well known than the broad outlines of his crimes and his political career. Understanding Hitler's daily routine is important not to humanize or to create sympathy for one of history's greatest criminals, but rather to understand how evil operates in practice, how a dictator actually exercises power on a daily basis, and how the banal routines of meals, meetings, and leisure activities can coexist with and enable the planning and execution of genocide and aggressive war. What did Hitler actually do all day during different periods of his dictatorship, from the early years of consolidating power in the 1930s through the wartime years when he directed military operations that killed millions, to the final days in his Berlin bunker? How did his daily habits, his working methods, his personal eccentricities, and his chaotic approach to governance shape the functioning of Nazi Germany and the implementation of its catastrophic policies? Today, we'll reconstruct Hitler's daily life across different periods and contexts, examining the late rising and breakfast, the hours of reading newspapers and discussing current events, the lengthy monologues over lunch and dinner, the afternoon walks and tea times, the late-night movie screenings, the military conferences that consumed increasing amounts of time during the war, and the overall pattern of days that combined elements of conventional political leadership with the idiosyncratic habits of a man who rejected normal working patterns and who governed through personal charisma, fear, and an ideology of hatred that produced history's most terrible crimes. Understanding Hitler's daily routine requires acknowledging several important points before proceeding with detailed description. First, Hitler's routine varied significantly across different periods of his dictatorship, with the peacetime years from 1933 to 1939 showing very different patterns from the wartime years from 1939 to 1945, and with his final months in 1945, showing further deterioration into the chaos of the bunker period. Second, Hitler's working style was fundamentally different from that of most political leaders, characterized by extreme irregularity, by avoidance of systematic work on papers and documents, by preference for verbal orders and discussions rather than written directives, and by a daily schedule that most observers considered shockingly undisciplined and unproductive for someone bearing such enormous responsibilities. Third, the sources for reconstructing Hitler's daily routine include memoirs from his secretaries, adjutants, architects, military officers, and others who observed him closely, documents from his regime, and historical research. But these sources are incomplete and sometimes contradictory, requiring careful interpretation. And fourth, describing Hitler's daily routine is not intended to normalize or minimize his crimes, but rather to understand how genocide and war were planned and directed within the context of daily activities that included ordinary elements of eating, sleeping, socializing, and recreation, alongside the monstrous decisions that caused mass death. Hitler's morning typically began very late by the standards of most political leaders, usually not before 10 or 11 in the morning, and sometimes even later, particularly during the peacetime years, when he had no fixed schedule requiring early rising. Unlike leaders such as Churchill, who worked from bed for hours each morning, or Roosevelt, who also started relatively late, but who had structured morning routines, Hitler simply slept late and then rose without any particular urgency or schedule. This late rising was partly Hitler's natural preference, as he was a night person who stayed up very late and who consequently slept late into the morning, and partly a reflection of his general approach to leadership, which rejected the conventional expectations of regular hours, systematic work, and visible industry that most political figures accepted as necessary. Hitler apparently believed that his genius required him to work according to his own rhythms rather than conforming to conventional schedules, and he surrounded himself with staff and systems that accommodated his preferences rather than challenging them. When Hitler finally woke, typically in his bedroom, at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin during the early years of his dictatorship, or at the Berghof, his mountain residence above Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, where he spent increasing amounts of time, or at various military headquarters during the war. His first activities were entirely personal rather than official. He would take a lengthy bath, a ritual that he apparently found important for his morning routine, and he would be dressed by his valet in the simple dark suits, or later in the plain military-style uniform that became his standard attire. Hitler was particular about his clothing and maintained careful attention to his appearance despite the simplicity of his wardrobe, understanding that visual presentation mattered for political leadership, even if his clothing choices emphasized supposed modesty and identification with ordinary Germans rather than the aristocratic elegance or military decoration that some leaders preferred. Hitler's breakfast, taken well into late morning or even around midday, was extremely modest by the standards of other leaders and reflected his vegetarian diet and his general lack of interest in food as pleasure or as social ritual in the morning. Hitler had become increasingly vegetarian during the 1930s, claiming various health and ethical reasons, though the exact motivations remain debated by historians. His typical breakfast consisted of milk or tea, perhaps some bread or pastries, and occasionally some fruit, a sparse meal that stood in stark contrast to the substantial breakfasts that Churchill or Roosevelt enjoyed. Hitler ate quickly and without particular enjoyment, treating breakfast as necessary fuel rather than as a meal to be savored, and he typically breakfasted alone or with only his immediate personal staff, rather than using the morning meal as a working occasion. After breakfast, Hitler's morning activities during peacetime years were remarkably unstructured and often consisted primarily of reading newspapers, a task that consumed several hours, and that Hitler treated as one of his most important daily activities. Hitler was obsessive about newspapers, reading numerous German papers, and receiving summaries of foreign press, following how he and his regime were being covered, noting criticism and praise, and generally maintaining close attention to public opinion and to how his propaganda was succeeding or failing. Unlike leaders who read newspapers as information sources to supplement other forms of briefing and analysis, Hitler seemed to treat newspapers as primary sources of information about the world and to give them weight that many observers considered excessive. His reading was not systematic analysis, but rather emotional engagement, as he would become enraged by critical articles, would praise those that flattered him, and would discuss at length articles that he found interesting or offensive. The newspaper reading typically occurred in Hitler's study or sitting room, surrounded by his immediate entourage, including personal adjutants, secretaries, and various hangers-on who formed the court that surrounded Hitler constantly. This entourage served multiple purposes, including providing assistance with Hitler's daily needs, offering an audience for his monologues and opinions, handling administrative tasks, and generally creating the atmosphere of constant attention and deference that Hitler required. The members of this inner circle lived strange lives themselves, as they were on call constantly to match Hitler's irregular schedule, had to be available whenever he wanted company or conversation, and had to endure his lengthy monologues without being able to contribute substantive conversation or to escape until dismissed. During the late morning and early afternoon, Hitler might receive official visitors, including ministers, party officials, foreign diplomats, and others who needed to see him for government business. However, these official audiences were irregular and often brief, as Hitler disliked systematic government work and preferred to avoid detailed administrative tasks or extensive discussions of policy implementation. Visitors would be granted audiences based on Hitler's mood and interest, rather than based on systematic scheduling or on the urgency of the business requiring attention. Many important matters were left unaddressed for extended periods because Hitler simply did not want to deal with them, creating administrative chaos as ministers and officials waited for decisions that Hitler delayed making or addressing. Hitler's working style, if it can be called that, was fundamentally different from conventional governmental administration. He did not maintain regular office hours, did not work systematically through papers requiring decisions, did not hold regular cabinet meetings or structured policy discussions, and generally avoided the disciplined, methodical approach to governance that effective administration requires. Instead, Hitler governed through sporadic interventions, through verbal orders given casually in conversations, through vague general directions that subordinates had to interpret and implement, and through the creation of overlapping authorities and competing power centers that he apparently believed would prevent any single subordinate from accumulating enough power to challenge him, while also ensuring that the most radical interpretations of his will would triumph through competition among subordinates. This approach, sometimes called working toward the Führer, meant that Hitler's subordinates competed to implement what they understood to be his wishes, often radicalizing policy beyond what Hitler had explicitly ordered as they tried to please him and to demonstrate their ideological zeal. The most important and time-consuming part of Hitler's peacetime daily routine was the lengthy lunch that typically began in early or mid-afternoon, reflecting his late rising and his lack of structured morning work. Lunch at the Reich Chancellery, or at the Berghof, was a major social occasion, lasting several hours, featuring substantial food despite Hitler's own vegetarian restrictions, and including a rotating cast of guests drawn from party officials, military officers, artists and architects, old party comrades, and various others whose company Hitler found interesting or useful. These lunches were working occasions only in the loosest sense, as formal business was rarely conducted, but they served important purposes in maintaining Hitler's network of relationships, in allowing him to hold court and to demonstrate his supposed common touch by dining with subordinates, rather than maintaining aristocratic distance, and in providing Hitler with audiences for the lengthy monologues that were his primary mode of communication and expression. Hitler's lunchtime monologues were legendary and were recorded in various forms, including the so-called table talk, transcripts of his lunchtime and dinner conversations that were compiled by Martin Bormann and that provide insight into Hitler's thinking across a wide range of subjects. The monologues could last for hours, with Hitler holding forth on any topic that interested him, including political philosophy, military history, architecture, art, race theory, his personal history and his rise to power, his opinions about people and events, his plans for the future, and essentially anything else that entered his mind. The format was not conversation, but rather performance, as Hitler's companions were expected to listen attentively and to provide only brief, supportive comments, rather than challenging or extensively discussing what Hitler said. Those who attended these lunches regularly, including his secretaries who left memoirs describing the experience, found them tedious and exhausting, as the same stories and opinions would be repeated endlessly, and as there was no possibility of genuine intellectual exchange or debate. The content of Hitler's monologues, as recorded in table talk and described in memoirs, reveals his ideology, his obsessions, his hatreds, and his plans in ways that are historically valuable despite the moral repugnance of the material. His anti-Semitism, his racial theories, his contempt for democracy and for most of humanity, his social Darwinist view that life was struggle and that the strong should dominate the weak, his plans for conquering Eastern Europe and enslaving or exterminating its populations, his belief in his own genius, and his mission to transform Germany and the world, all these were expressed in his rambling lunchtime speeches. The monologues also reveal Hitler's intellectual shallowness, despite his pretensions to profound thinking. As his historical knowledge was superficial and often wrong, his cultural opinions were those of a failed artist with resentments rather than genuine aesthetic understanding, and his political philosophy was a crude mixture of half-digested ideas, personal prejudices, and ideology that substituted certainty for reasoning. After the extended lunch, Hitler's afternoon activities during peacetime typically included walks in the gardens at the Berghof or in the Chancellery grounds in Berlin, accompanied by his German shepherd dog, Blondie, whom he had received in 1941 and who became his constant companion, and by members of his entourage who would walk with him while he continued his monologues or while he occasionally engaged in brief exchanges. Hitler was not physically active by temperament, and his walking was leisurely rather than vigorous. But he apparently enjoyed being outdoors and found the walking mildly beneficial. The walks served no particular purpose beyond personal preference and perhaps minimal exercise, and they were simply extensions of the general time-filling that characterized Hitler's days when he was not engaged in specific tasks. Tea time in the late afternoon was another regular social occasion at the Berghof, and sometimes in Berlin, modeled somewhat on English customs, but adapted to Hitler's preferences and to the German context. Tea would be served with cakes and pastries, which Hitler enjoyed despite his general lack of interest in food, and the occasion would again provide opportunity for socializing with guests, for Hitler's monologues, and for the kind of informal holding of court that filled much of his time. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion who lived at the Berghof and who was kept carefully hidden from public view throughout their relationship, would typically be present at tea and at the evening meals and social occasions, though her role was ornamental and social rather than political or influential. Eva's daily life was one of enforced idleness and boredom, as she had no official role, was not allowed to be publicly acknowledged, and was expected to provide company and decorative presence without exercising any influence or even having serious conversations about political matters. Dinner was another lengthy meal, typically beginning around 8 or 9 in the evening and following the same pattern as lunch with substantial food, selected guests, and Hitler's monologues dominating the occasion. The meals at Hitler's table were reportedly good, despite his vegetarian requirements, as his cook prepared meat dishes for guests while providing vegetarian alternatives for Hitler himself, and the atmosphere was supposed to be relaxed and social rather than formal and stiff. However, many guests found the experience oppressive rather than enjoyable, as Hitler's presence dominated everything, as genuine conversation was impossible, and as the hours dragged on with Hitler's repetitive stories and opinions, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously privileged as one was dining with the Führer, and tedious, as the intellectual level was low and the format was so rigid. After dinner, Hitler's evening activities typically centered on watching films, which he did almost nightly, and which represented one of his primary forms of recreation and relaxation. Hitler loved movies, particularly light entertainment, including musicals, comedies, and adventure films, and he had screening rooms at his various residences where he would watch films late into the night. The film viewing typically began around 10 or 11 and could continue until 1, 2, or even 3 in the morning, with Hitler watching 1 or sometimes 2 full-length films per night. The selection was made from both German films and from captured foreign films, including American productions, and Hitler's preferences ran toward entertainment rather than propaganda or serious drama, as he apparently wanted escape and amusement rather than politically edifying content during his viewing hours. The evening films were attended by whoever was present in Hitler's entourage, and by any guests remaining after dinner, and attendance was essentially mandatory for those present, as Hitler wanted company during his viewing, even though there was no conversation during the films. Many of those required to attend these nightly film sessions found them tiresome and would have preferred to go to bed at reasonable hours. But Hitler's schedule determined everyone else's schedule, and his preference for very late nights meant that his entire household and staff had to adapt to keeping similar hours. The secretaries, adjutants, valets, and others who served Hitler developed a shared experience of exhaustion and of living according to a bizarre schedule that was completely at odds with normal human patterns, but that was absolutely required by Hitler's preferences. Hitler's late nights meant he typically did not go to bed until 3, 4, or even 5 in the morning, hours that most people would consider middle of the night rather than bedtime. His bedroom routine apparently included reading, as Hitler would sometimes read in bed before sleeping, though his reading was not extensive or systematic, and consisted primarily of newspapers and magazines, military reports, some history and biography, and the various briefing papers and documents that occasionally required his attention. Unlike Churchill, who dictated prolifically or Roosevelt, who maintained substantial correspondence. Hitler did not write or dictate extensively, and his intellectual production beyond his speeches was minimal. He had dictated Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess in the 1920s and had produced some other materials in his early political career. But as dictator, he largely ceased producing written work beyond the occasional speech or proclamation, preferring verbal orders and allowing subordinates to document and implement his directives. During the wartime years from 1939 to 1945, Hitler's daily routine changed significantly as military affairs consumed increasing amounts of his time and attention. Though many of the basic patterns of late rising, lengthy meals, and late nights persisted, even as the content of his days shifted toward military management. Hitler spent the war years primarily at various military headquarters rather than in Berlin or at the Berghof, moving between the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Wolfsschlucht headquarters in France, and later Ukraine, and other command posts from which he directed military operations. These headquarters were bunker complexes in remote locations, surrounded by security, and designed to protect Hitler from air attack and ground assault while providing the communications and facilities needed to command the armed forces. Hitler's mornings during wartime still began late, though the military situation sometimes required earlier rising when crises demanded immediate attention. After his usual morning routine of bathing and dressing and a light breakfast, Hitler's working day now centered on military conferences, the daily briefings where commanders reported on the military situation and where operational decisions were made. The military conferences became the most important and time-consuming activities in Hitler's daily routine during the war, consuming many hours daily and providing the forum where Hitler exercised direct command over military operations in ways that his generals often found frustrating and counterproductive. The midday military conference typically began around noon or early afternoon after Hitler had completed his morning reading and personal routine, and it could last for several hours depending on the military situation and on how much Hitler wanted to discuss. The conferences were attended by Hitler's military adjutants, by representatives from the various services and commands including the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Navy, by Hitler's chief military advisors, including Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, and by various other officers, depending on what theaters and operations were being discussed. The format involved officers presenting situation reports describing the current positions of German and enemy forces, the previous day's developments, intelligence about enemy activities, and proposals for operations and decisions requiring Hitler's approval. Hitler's involvement in these military conferences was detailed and hands-on in ways that professional military officers found both impressive in terms of his memory and grasp of details, and deeply problematic in terms of his interference in operational matters and his refusal to accept military advice that contradicted his intuitions or his ideological beliefs. Hitler maintained enormous maps showing all fronts and all major units, and he would follow operations closely, asking questions about specific divisions, about supply situations, about casualties and strengths, and generally demonstrating detailed knowledge of the military situation. However, his decisions were often driven by ideology or by personal will rather than by military logic, as he would refuse to authorize retreats even when military necessity clearly required them, would insist on holding indefensible positions for political or symbolic reasons, would launch operations that his generals advised against, and generally exercised command in ways that contributed to German defeats and that wasted lives and resources. The military conferences were also occasions for Hitler's monologues and for his verbal abuse of commanders, as he would rant about the weakness or incompetence of the German military, would blame generals for failures, would accuse officers of lacking will or National Socialist conviction, and would generally create an atmosphere of fear and hostility that corroded the military command structure. Officers attending these conferences had to endure Hitler's tirades, had to defend their decisions against often unfair criticism, and had to find ways to implement Hitler's sometimes impossible or disastrous orders while minimizing the damage. The stenographic records of these military conferences that have survived provide detailed evidence of Hitler's working style, his military decision-making, and his interaction with his commanders, revealing a man who combined genuine interest in military affairs with profound strategic incompetence and with an ideology-driven refusal to accept reality. The afternoon during wartime typically included a second military conference providing updates on developments since the midday briefing, more discussions of ongoing operations, and additional opportunities for Hitler to issue directives and to conduct his monologues. Between conferences, Hitler might meet individually with commanders or with officials about specific matters, though as during peacetime he avoided systematic administrative work and preferred verbal exchanges to written documents. The meals during wartime at military headquarters maintained the same patterns as during peacetime, with lengthy lunches and dinners, extensive monologues, and required attendance by entourage and guests, though the guest lists were necessarily more limited to those present at the remote headquarters locations, and the atmosphere was presumably more strained, given the deteriorating military situation. As the war turned increasingly against Germany from 1942 onwards, with defeats at Stalingrad and El Alamein, with the loss of air superiority, with increasing Allied bombing of German cities, with the successful Allied invasions of Italy and France, and with the steady advance of Soviet forces from the east, Hitler's daily routine showed signs of increasing stress and deterioration. His health problems, including Parkinson's disease or a similar neurological condition that caused tremors in his left hand and arm, digestive issues that he treated with various questionable medications provided by his personal physician doctor, Theodor Morell, and general physical decline from stress and from his unhealthy lifestyle, all affected his functioning. The tremors became increasingly visible, his posture became stooped, his energy declined, and observers noted that he appeared to age rapidly during the final war years. Hitler's response to military defeats and to the deteriorating situation was to withdraw further into his headquarters bunkers, to limit contact with the outside world, to refuse to visit bombed German cities, or to see directly the suffering of the population, and to retreat into fantasy and denial about Germany's prospects. His monologues during this period, as recorded by those who heard them, became increasingly divorced from reality, with Hitler claiming that Germany would still win through miracle weapons, through the supposed collapse of the Allied coalition, through German will overcoming material disadvantages, and through various other delusions that substituted for realistic assessment. Even as the military situation became hopeless, Hitler refused to consider surrender or negotiated peace, insisting that Germany must fight to total victory or total destruction, and he ordered increasingly desperate operations and demanded continued resistance, even when military logic clearly indicated that continuation of the war only increased German casualties and suffering without any possibility of changing the outcome. The final months of Hitler's life, from January to April 1945, were spent primarily in the Führerbunker in Berlin, the underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, where Hitler moved in January 1945 as Soviet forces approached from the east. The bunker was a cramped, uncomfortable facility, with thick concrete walls and ceiling, minimal natural light and ventilation, and an oppressive atmosphere that reflected both the physical conditions and the psychological reality of the regime's final collapse. Hitler's daily routine in the bunker maintained some elements of his earlier patterns, but deteriorated significantly as the situation became increasingly desperate and as his physical and mental condition declined. The bunker days still began late, with Hitler rising around noon or early afternoon, though the exact timing became increasingly irregular as sleep was disturbed by the constant Soviet artillery bombardment of Berlin and by the stress of the situation. The military conferences continued and even intensified, as Hitler was now directing the defense of Berlin and was issuing orders to phantom armies that no longer existed, or that were far too weak to accomplish the tasks he assigned them. The conferences in the bunker were marked by increasing desperation, rage, and disconnection from reality, with Hitler ordering operations that were impossible, blaming commanders for defeats, and generally exhibiting the behavior of someone whose mental state was severely compromised by stress, illness, and the psychological effects of facing absolute defeat. The meals in the bunker were simpler and less formal than the elaborate lunches and dinners of earlier years, but Hitler still took meals with his entourage and still dominated with his monologues, though the content was increasingly dark, self-pitying, and sometimes wildly optimistic, in ways that conflicted with the obvious reality. Eva Braun had joined Hitler in the bunker in April 1945, despite his orders that she should leave Berlin, and she was present during the final days, providing some companionship and attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy through her presence and through her determination to die with Hitler rather than survive him. Hitler's final days in the bunker included his marriage to Eva Braun on April 29, 1945, a brief civil ceremony conducted while Soviet forces were fighting in streets just blocks away from the bunker. The marriage was Hitler's acknowledgement of Eva's loyalty and his decision to legitimize their relationship in the final hours before death, though it had no practical significance given that both planned to commit suicide shortly. Hitler spent his final hours dictating his political testament, a document that blamed Jews for the war, that expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the party for attempting to negotiate with the Allies, that appointed new government leaders to succeed him, and that generally demonstrated that Hitler remained committed to his ideology and his hatreds, literally until his final moments. On April 30th, 1945, in the early afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in his private quarters in the bunker, Hitler shooting himself while Eva took cyanide, ending both their lives and ending the Nazi regime's leadership at the moment when Soviet forces were within a few hundred meters of the bunker, and when Germany's defeat was hours or days away from completion. Reconstructing Hitler's daily routine across the years of his dictatorship reveals several consistent patterns, despite variations in circumstances and contexts. His extremely late rising and his night owl schedule persisted throughout, reflecting his natural rhythms, but also his rejection of conventional expectations about leadership and work. His avoidance of systematic administrative work and his preference for verbal orders and informal directives over written documents and structured processes created a chaotic governance system that depended on his personal authority. But that was fundamentally inefficient, and that created constant competition and conflict among his subordinates. His lengthy monologues over meals and his requirement that his entourage attend and listen for hours reflected both his need for audiences and his inability or unwillingness to engage in genuine conversation or to hear dissenting views. His love of films and his nightly viewing habits represented his desire for escape and entertainment, even as he was planning and executing war and genocide. And his increasing withdrawal into bunkers and his refusal to face directly the consequences of his policies demonstrated both physical cowardice and psychological inability to confront the reality of the suffering he caused. The banality of Hitler's daily routine, filled with ordinary activities like reading newspapers, eating meals, walking dogs, and watching movies, coexisted with the extraordinary evil of his decisions and actions, demonstrating the disturbing reality that genocide and aggressive war were planned and directed within the context of a daily life that included mundane and normal elements. Hitler's routine also reveals the profound dysfunction of his leadership style, as his chaotic schedule, his avoidance of systematic work, his reliance on verbal orders that created confusion, and his interference in operational details that should have been delegated to commanders, all contributed to Nazi Germany's inefficiency and ultimately to its defeat, though not before it had inflicted catastrophic damage on the world.